Hello, welcome to stream number 66 in this series where I am programming an NES game live on Twitch from scratch. Hopefully, audio is even better than last time because in addition to turning up the volume, I got a new audio interface for the PC that uses USB to interface before I was going through the motherboard line-in audio, and I was doing that because I have a really good microphone interface that unfortunately only has Thunderbolt, which is great for my Mac, but not for this PC. So hopefully this will allow for some better capture without the noise, even with the volume turned up a little bit more. I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments on the video recording on YouTube. Same setup, microphone moved to a different location, but with the new interface. So, where we left off last time is we were looking at how we were going to handle pallets. And the reason we did that was because if we have too many pallets that we try to use on screen at any given time, we will run into the problem of the items not having the right colors, right? So we have, for example, if we have this sprite and this sprite and this sprite and this sprite all using different palettes, then the problem will be that the colors that we display won't be consistent with what we actually have in our sprite definition here for the level and the project. And in talking to some of the guys over on the Nintendo Age Discord, there is no, or at least not to their knowledge, a sort of standardized way of handling pallets here. Palette management is sort of on a game-by-game basis. So if you're doing something where you want to keep the palettes static, you can do that if that makes sense for your game. And if you want to swap them dynamically as you go, you can do that too. So we have to figure out how we want to handle this. One of the other things we were trying to do was use this palette swap button to allow us to do the selecting of items and actually switching from item to item for each item to swap the palette of the item and get the result we were looking for, so that we could consolidate palettes ourselves rather than relying on the tool to figure it out, which is something we can do later, but it's simpler to just kind of manually manage them right now, especially with the smaller number of assets that we have. But the problem we're running into here, and it's not really that surprising in some sense, but also sort of disappointing, is that while the asset tool user interface is working fine, we've kind of hit some limitations in terms of what it supports, the user interface itself. And of course, keep in mind that, all of these user interface elements, this list and these buttons and this palette control, these are all things that I've built from just, taking what's it called, Tiger, and using it to draw the elements on the window, which is great in the sense that technically, that is cross-platform compatible because it supports doing this on Mac and PC with the same code. But on the flip side, the problem we're facing is anytime we want to do something that doesn't exist, like a checkbox in our, in this tool set, I've got to build code to build a checkbox or a window, or things that are pretty standard to user interface tools. And it's sort of cumbersome to have to build all of those things, especially because I'm trying to focus on the game stuff more so than the tool stuff. And at some point, I guess where I'm going with all of this is that, I'm looking at the tool set we're building here and thinking that we are not going the most efficient way. And I apologize if this is all kind of rambly right now. I'm pretty exhausted. This week has been very tiring, and so this is going to be a shorter stream and maybe a little bit more rambly than usual. But just bear with me. So part of the challenge that I'm trying to overcome is that we want to go from raw asset like PNG to load it into the game as quickly as possible. And some of the decisions we've made have been fine for what we were doing in the beginning of trying to get from point A to point B in the shortest period of time, because from the perspective of what I knew how to do, it was the fastest way to do it. But from an overall perspective of getting the game content to move through the stages that it needs to where it can be used in the actual game, I think the approach we've taken isn't necessarily the best approach, because there's a lot of added extra steps for all of the things that need to be done. And so somewhat reluctantly, I think what I'm going to end up doing is changing the asset tool code that we have here to be factored out of the user interface and be more like library stuff that we can then leverage with a front end. The idea being that we want to be able to use that back end or library code in a not only just a Windows user interface tool, but also on other platforms potentially later. So, and that would mean, building the user interface from the beginning, but I think that that's probably the better route, because me sitting and building, windows and list boxes and drop downs and stuff like that, while it's interesting, now that we've progressed and we've got these 66 streams here, I'm, getting to a point where I see the sort of the, I don't want to say the mistake, but just, how that early decision, while it led to doing something interesting, was maybe not the best approach, or certainly not the most efficient one. So I think I'm going to start by kind of doing what I said and starting over with the user interface part itself. And the good thing about doing this is that we know that, or I know that, building the user interface using standard tools is actually not that hard, and we can do a lot more pretty quickly than we would using what I built. So I forget if I have to put this additional folder here, but so let's see. Trying to think what's the best way. Multiple documents. Dialogue based is the easiest for me. Get rid of this. I want this to be a static library so we don't have to deal with making sure that we have all the MFC stuff properly installed or contained with the tool. These are just so the downside to doing this is that, you know, we do have to kind of start over with some of the way the user interface things kind of fit together. But on the flip side, it's not really that challenging. The other sort of annoyance is that this is all C++ based, but it is, I think, easier to use and faster to use versus the standard Windows dialogue stuff, or sorry, design tools. What am I looking for here? Where is... All right, so similar to kind of what we had before, we can have the same thing. We'll have our list here, right? And then what we want to do, I'm going to set it up to anchor things properly here so that when we resize the window, it resizes as expected. Although that looks pretty good. I believe there's a way to test the dialogue. Just got to find where it is in this version. Oops. There it is. Okay, and then if we resize. Oh, we can't resize. We want to be able to, though. Where the hell is it? It's some esoteric thing they changed it to for resize. Has something to do with like the style of it or something like that. There we go. Okay, so we're going to adjust this to be anchored to the bottom so that it resizes accordingly. So let's do that. Anchor, where are you? Client edge. Where the hell is it? Move direction of a child control when a hosting window is being resized. Vertical. Is that what that is? They've changed these things quite a bit since the last time I messed with it, and yes, that changed the bottom, but that didn't change. That didn't stretch it. Moving type, vertical, sizing type, vertical. What did that do? Did it stretch it? That's bizarre. Okay. Except that it is going past the bottom. The sizing Y. Ratio defines how child controls are assigned when the size hasn't been changed. I'll have to read up on exactly what that does, but all right, let's call this project files. And what we want to do is want to get when the application launches, we want to get the stuff that was passed, just like we're doing in the asset tool here. Just make sure this builds. Okay. I don't know why. I thought that window was supposed to have the supposed to have the maximize and the minimize. There we go. Okay. Good. So let's do this. So one of the other things you do when you're working with these items is you why does it need a JavaScript file? one of the things you do is you can bind these controls to variables. So call this M project files. And then by doing that, if we go to the dialog, we have this new variable called project files in here. And so when we're initializing it, if we want to do something like add, we can so it added it here to the list, right? All right. So what we want to do is we want to take this code that we've written here and kind of start making this functionality accessible to this, so that this is just sort of driving front-end functionality. This is the actual code that understands what needs to happen to make that work. So let's open up. I don't want to change this in case I realize that this was a bad idea and that we don't want to go in that direction right now. So let's do this, and we'll call it NES asset lib. Okay. Let's get rid of the precompiled header nonsense. We don't need it. All right. So most of these functions that we're defining here are going to go into the library. The other thing we're going to need to put into the library as essentially a header file that we make available to the project is the stuff that defines the types. I think Microsoft supports that now, right? Okay, include. Okay. So let's copy all of our structures here. We gotta copy our types also. So let's see, file We're just moving all this stuff over. And some of it isn't going to make sense to move over, and we'll fix that. But where it does, we will move it over. So that's that. Go back to this. Start looking at what we can move over. So, for example, this whole load map thing. Now, this is part of what? Assert.h. Actually, let me do this. We don't need that there. We need this in here. Okay. So we also have to bring in the stuff for Tiger and Jasmine that we're using. I think they just have those 4 files. Okay. All right, so now we just got to include that. Okay. Cool. So we got rid of a bunch of the problems. Let's go back and pull over the system hook stuff. So this is relevant to the actual code. It's not something we need to share out in the library. Great, so I'm putting this in the C file because it's not something that we necessarily need to make use of in the UI or anything that would be accessing this. It's more relevant to the to this code here in the library. So what's the problem with malloc? Malloc undefined memory.h should have that. io.h. Standard lib.h. Okay. That was it. So get property. Nope, not in this file. So we need to copy all of these because these are used when we're dealing with the Jasmine JSON stuff. Probably gonna have to split this up somewhat because it's gonna get a little bit cumbersome, but we'll figure that out as we go. Get parent path. What's it? Replace file extension. Replace file extension. Need to remove file extension 2. File exists. Inline. Now the other thing is not all of these things are going to be made accessible through the library. These are just things that we need. These are helper functions. Maybe I'll separate these out into a separate C file. But they're not going to be exported to be available from the library, which means that they're not things that the linking code will be able to access because they're not exposed to the linker for that purpose. There are going to be things like that call to load map, for example. That'll be exposed so that we can use that when we need it. But these helper functions are not going to be. I just want to get this to compile, and then we'll sort of start organizing some things a little bit better here. Compare map objects. Why does it keep doing that? Compare map objects. Oh, that's for the sorting. All right, great. So that ran, or that compiled rather. So let's split up some of these things to different files here. I'm going to add a new header. For for JSON stuff. And we'll put the source into... We'll put the source into that, because although normally what you do is you do your definition of the function and then you'd have the source in a C file, it's probably not necessary, since this library I think will have just one main file, C file, that will kind of house the library code. We'll see, maybe not, and then I'll be sorry I did it this way. But like I've said a bunch of times, part of what we're doing here, because I'm not super familiar with building the game, a game on the NES, is trying to figure out what is the best way to do it. And so I'm changing up what we're doing as I find things that maybe make more sense. In terms of how we're, building our utilities and whatnot. So, all right. So that's our map objects. Got file name. Let's add another one for file. For files. So anything that's dealing with file management, like get the file name, get the absolute path, file exists, the extension stuff, the parent path stuff, have all that stuff live in this file. And pull it in through that. Get parent path. Oh. That has to be here. Okay. All right, so that's been taken care of. The map stuff now should work in theory based on the code. Now, I gotta think about, I don't remember. Let's take a look. There's a tool you can use to see, no, get out of here, Cortana. I don't want to talk to you. There's a tool you can use called Dump In. It's part of Visual Studio. It lets you none of these are the things that I want. It lets you export or view data that is exported rather from the library, a library that you're building. And there it is, developer command prompt. And we want to see, I want to look at what's actually being exported, because I don't think anything is, but I don't want to go under the assumption that that's true and then find out that I was wrong. And it's been a while since I've messed with this stuff, so exports. Okay, good. So nothing is currently being exported. I just need to refresh my memory on what you need to do. Windows lib export function. there is something you do in your C code. There are a couple of things, actually. There is... Alright, so you need a file... I gotta remember how to do this. You need a file that defines your exports. No, that's not what I want. And then the process of linking will take that file, the .def file, I believe it is, export .def. And that will... Let's see. Now for DLLs, you can use the DLL export, but we're not using a dynamic link library. This is a static library. I just gotta find it's been a while since I've had to look this up. There is a way to generate this def file. It's just a simple format, but it's escaping me. Lib creates the output files from the export specifications that are passed in the lib command. There are 3 methods of specifying exports. Visual Studio div file library. There it is. Okay. I don't know if this is going to be in here or if I just create a dummy file and rename it. Oh, there is. Okay. Let's call it NES asset lib.def. And so you say library NES asset lib exports. And then you can put in your list of exports. So if we want to say load map is one of our exports, we can say load map at 1, and then we build it, and when we run this, let's see, I thought it was just exports, but maybe not. Did it not? Oh, you know what? That's what I forgot to do. You can't just, it's not just defining the file, you have to actually pass it to the linker. And then you say NES asset lib.def. And then, all right, so here's the first thing. You see all this extra nonsense that it's adding there? That is name mangling, and that comes from the fact that by default, C++ does some weird things to your file names, your method names and function names. So what you want to do is you want to say extern C and wrap this whole thing in extern C. And the reason you want to do that is because then it will no longer mess with the name like it was doing before, and so now it's just load map. The reason you want to do that is because in the calling code that is referencing, well, I guess there are two ways that you can do this, where one way it doesn't matter as much, and another way it does. So if we wanted to do this where we're linking against this library and we have the header file, it shouldn't matter as long as we're being consistent about using C or C++ style calls. It shouldn't matter. The compiler should be able to figure out how to call load map from the library, even with this name mangling. And you'll see that part of what the name mangling is doing is it's adding information about the parameters that are getting called. And that has to do with stuff like how overriding and other C++ object-oriented things come into play. I don't even know exactly the details of it. It's not really important. All you have to know is that where it does matter is there are calls in Windows. You can do load library, load lib, library. So let's just load library. Close. What is it called? I thought it was just load library. Yeah, it is just load library. Do I just not have the header file included? Oh, yeah, because I don't have windows.h included. So load library loads a .dll file. Now this isn't a DLL, but if it were, we could do that. We could do this in a different way, where we could say, okay, we're not going to link directly against the DLL. We'll load the functions at runtime, and so you'd use load library to load the DLL, and then you would use free library to free it at the end, and then you could also make calls to get proc address. And so if you try and do a call to get proc address to get load map, which you would need if you wanted to call that function, with the name mangling turned on, it creates a problem because it has no idea what load map is. It's looking for you to pass in all this stuff. If you do extern C, then it uses C naming and you get the load map. But actually thinking about this, because this is a static library and not a DLL where we're going to be dynamically loading the methods, I'm thinking we just leave it as is. As long as it's exporting it, it should be fine. So, all right, so we have that. Let's also do, I want to bring in another method that's a little bit simpler to call, like load meta tile or something, or load sprite, where it doesn't have quite as much associated with it. So that we can try that from our from the new asset tool project. Make sure that that works. Okay, so that compiled, and now both of those are exported, and then here's the new asset tool. So what we're going to do is, in the configuration here, we're going to add an additional dependency, and the additional dependency is going to be NES assetlib.lib. And we want to add to the linker an additional library directory to look at, which is projects NES asset lib, NES asset lib, debug. I believe that is, there may be one additional folder. Nope. Okay, good. That's that. So apply that. Let's make sure that it doesn't complain when it tries to link against it. It didn't. All right. So then what we want to do is we need to create a header file for use when someone's using this library. So we're going to call this I'm gonna let's rename this to the internal file, because it's got a whole bunch of stuff. Well, actually, there's some stuff that we need, there's some stuff that we don't, maybe. All right, I take that back. Let's leave it alone. But what we do need to do in here is we need to define these methods. So we need to have a definition, a forward definition of this, and a forward definition of that. And basically, all this is saying is to the compiler, hey, there is a function called load metatile and load map, and they're not defined here, but you will find them when you go to link. That's what this is essentially doing. Now, this is the problem of needing the tiger structure. So there's really no choice but to... Okay, so there's really no other choice but to include that. Okay. So now, from here, I can add another path for our includes. So I can say I want to include NES asset lib. Oh, that's libraries. In here, general additional include directories. So that's that. And so then I want to actually include that. I say NES asset lib.h. Can it open? Let's see, where is that defined that it can't find it? NES asset lib.h. Oh, it's in the bowels of all those paths. Okay, so that compiled successfully. Now, if we try to invoke load metatile, we need a metatile to load it into. Once the address. And then let's give it a file name. Let's just hard code this for right now. Shooter assets. Tile sets. Well, wait a minute. So is this looking for a dot meta tile, or what is this? Right. Let's take a look. I don't even remember. Load meta tile. This is looking for the dot meta tile file. Okay. So where are those? Here under PNG. Okay. So let's go back to this. Assets, PNG. And let's load bumper.metatile. And basically all I want to do is make sure that when, first of all, we can compile that. Second of all, that when it actually runs it, it loads the metatile data into memory. It doesn't need, it's not a DLL input. Debug. Yeah, what are you talking about? It's not a DLL. Additional dependencies. Static library. Use standard Windows libraries. Link library dependencies. All options. What are you talking about here? You know, the other thing is, we want to remove the default libraries from here because that would potentially create a conflict with anybody trying to load or link the library. So, because when you're building your code, you're pulling in, there are a bunch of standard libraries that Microsoft includes in your code, and then when you go to try and link it to another application that's also using those libraries, it creates problems sometimes. So, better not to include it. The code execution cannot proceed because as a DLL was not found. It shouldn't. There is no DLL. It's a static library. What are you talking about? Did Microsoft break static libraries or something? Two uses of lib files for static linking, but there's another one called import library, which is what you have. But it's not an import library, it's a static library. Right? File type library. It's for a C++ class, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same idea. So let's see what they say. So create static library. Create the header files, create that stuff. Okay, build solution. When you build the solution, you must build the program in 2 steps. First run to compile, create the object, and then second run lib, create the lib. You'd think that it would have done the right steps here. Let's see if that matches. So it's saying to run lib with just the object files. Strange that it's command line. Compile the static by building build solution. Compiling creates a static library that can be used by other programs. When you build on Visual Studio command line, oh, that's just for command line. So there shouldn't have to do anything special here. This is truly bizarre. So this is a static library, so not sure what else needs to happen for it to actually be treated that way. MSVC linking static library for DLL or DLL error. How about that? Okay. I have the library file here in the input where it's supposed to be. The path is there. It's linking. Ignore import library. No. Okay. I mean, if I get rid of this, right? It should fail to build. And it did, which is good. Okay, so now what's the problem? Let me look up the cannot proceed because, okay, so cannot proceed because DLL not found static library. No. Boy, this is just trying to make this as hard as possible, huh? I don't understand why this thinks that it should be a DLL that it's looking for. It's specifically created as a static library. The dependency is just included like any other freaking dependency. What is its deal right now? The DLL doesn't exist. It's not that kind of library. Error DLL static library. Let's see if I can figure out what Google wants in order to find this. It's so stupid. Let me try just searching the error and static library and see what I get here. The code execution cannot proceed because, and then static library. This is x86, that's x86. Nobody figured out that problem. I don't understand. It's why is this so hard? Why is this so hard for it to figure out? Sets a bit and deal. Stop it. Indicates bind that the image is not allowed to be bound. You may want a DLL to be bound. No. Overrides the default import library name versus what? What's the difference? Overrides the default import library name. TLB ID. So let me just try this. I don't think this is going to work, but yeah, I didn't think so. Okay. So I don't understand how this is broken to the point where it thinks it should be loading a DLL for a static library. Output file additional. Ignore all default libraries. Link library dependencies. Target machine. All right. I'm done. I'm not going to waste your time with me trying to figure this out. I'll let you guys know next time what I figured out and why this dumb thing isn't working. As always, thanks for watching. I will catch you on Monday of next week, 9 p.m. Eastern. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to add it to the comments on the description in the video on YouTube. Reach out to me on Twitter at Clairvis, and on Nintendo Age, I'm on the Discord. We'll get back to some more NES stuff, hopefully by Monday. Sorry that this was kind of a disaster. Didn't mean for it to be, but have a good weekend. Talk to you next time. See ya.